Thanks everyone for joining so promptly. We'll get started. Hopefully you can see my slides. I think you can already. This webinar is all about how to provide students with real-world business experience. So we'll be covering a range of things. So developing students' core competencies and graduate attributes. We'll be looking at applied learning and competency-based education strategies. Well, there's a few more bullet points on there. Perhaps I won't read them all out. But just to say, I'm delighted to have our guest speaker this time, David Preece, Associate Professor at Brigham Young University in Hawaii. David, would you like to say hello?
Aloha, everybody. Thank you for having me.
Oh, well, the pleasure's all ours. We're really grateful for you to join us. Yeah, we're really looking forward to getting to the conversation. I know you've been using the simulation for quite some time, so somewhat of an expert in it now, I think it's fair to say. Yeah, no, really glad you could make it. For everyone else who doesn't know me, I'm Leon Lloyd. I'm a business development manager with Edumando. And what we like to do is just to take a few minutes to, well, maybe 5 or so minutes, just to sort of give a bit of a background to us as a company, what we do and our approach to simulations. And then we'll get straight into the conversation with our guest speaker, David. We'll try to also keep some time for giving an overview of the tour operator simulation, which is the management simulation used by David already with his students. And yeah, we'll make sure there's some time for a Q&A at the end as well. So feel free to leave your questions to the end if you'd like, and we'll ensure there's some good time to answer those questions. But at the same time, feel free to put your questions in the chat as we go. And I'll try and keep an eye on it. And we've got some colleagues behind the scenes who are also keeping an eye on the chat as well. So that's fine. As always, we're recording the session. We'll share a link to the recording for anyone who's joined today and for anyone who signed up that couldn't make it now as well. Yeah, let's get into it. So a little bit about Edumando. Well, we're a company that's specializing in, educational solutions, digital educational solutions for the higher education market. So we're typically serving business schools, but all over the world. We've been developing management simulations for 20 years, so since 2001. And we've branched out into other areas as well now. So we're not just doing simulations, although that's still the core focus of what we do. We have around 40 employees, mostly based in our head office in The Hague in the Netherlands. But I'm in the UK, and we have a few other colleagues in the UK, and we have colleagues in other parts of the world too. We're active in all continents of the world, so around about 300 universities using our simulations and other products in all continents of the world. And well, we also work with the private sector as well. So we work with some large corporates as well as higher education institutions. And some of those large corporates work with us around their talent acquisition schemes, for example. So as they're trying to impress and manage early talent, but also leadership development as well. And as you can imagine, it's quite a large number of students using our simulations each year. So whilst we have quite a large portfolio of simulations covering most business subjects, there are some commonalities between them. So for example, they're all web-based. They work on the browser. As you'd expect these days, isn't it? You know, you don't want to have to be installing software, but they work on any device too. So you can access from your smartphone, for example, although, well, it's a lot of information to consume for students. So it's best to have a big screen where possible. But it works in the way that students will be put into teams of perhaps 4 or 5 or 6 in a team. It depends, really. It's highly flexible. So they'll be in their teams and they'll take over an existing company. And they'll have a load of internal and external analysis to do straight away before they formulate their business plan, their strategic direction of the company, which of course they decide upon in their teams. And then they take a load of strategic decisions or tactical actions through a number of rounds, where one round equates to 1 year of operations. So 1 year of one financial year. So usually that's mapped across a semester, where it might be 6 to 10 rounds, for example, across the same number of weeks. But that's also highly flexible as well. And we have many examples of much more intensive delivery where the simulations are used on 1 day or 2 days, for example. The time investment is actually highly flexible. So it depends on how much time you've got to allocate to the students to work in their teams. And of course, if you've got like a 2-hour workshop, for example, on a Wednesday morning, well, that's the time you can ask the students to work in their teams. And the students will make the relevant decisions according to the allotted time they've been given. What's really nice, actually, is we often see that students will carry on outside of the dedicated time in their own time in their teams, which really is nice to see sort of from an engagement standpoint. And importantly, all our simulations have a dynamic algorithm, which means that the teams are directly competing against the other student teams in the same class or the same course. And that's really important because actually it's what's driving the engagement. So whilst we don't want to necessarily have the ranking list reflect how the students are ultimately performing on their course, it should be the case that the ranking list is driving the engagement. So anyway, rather than students competing against a computer, it's much more close to real life when they're competing against, of course, the other student teams on the same module. And just a couple of other things to say on this slide. You know, we cater for all student levels and they're highly flexible depending on how we set them up. So yeah, just a couple more things to say on why simulations in general. Well, we typically see, you know, results such as these. So it's all about getting that engagement levels improved. So we typically see that module or course evaluations go right up after using the simulation. So student satisfaction is really improved. And in comparison to courses which don't have simulations featured, we often see a strong improvement in those which do. This links strongly to sort of continuation rates. So students actually carrying on beyond the first 6 months of study. And well, of course, retention levels have massive financial and reputational implications as well. All our simulations, whilst we don't directly deal with the skills part from a theory standpoint, the employability skills, the competencies that they'll gain are just as important really as the application of theoretical knowledge. So that's so important, and we'll be talking a little bit more about that later. The last part on here is part of the student offer and recruitment. Well, that's about closing the loop, really. We often find where simulations are used, especially as part of a strategic approach to experiential learning within the business school, that this message is also built back into the recruitment proposition, the student offer. So on the website, on the open days, the marketing proposition, students want to learn, they want to go to do their studies at places where they know they'll get these types of experiences. So last slide from me before we get into the conversation with David is just to sort of say that we have a range of different simulations. And on the left here, we've got some screenshots, which are showing direct screenshots from all the various simulations we have. And on the right here, we've listed some of the core course subjects or module subjects where we'll often find our simulations are used. So it's quite a range of different courses, as you can tell. Which means that we've got quite a good offering to be able to be that experiential learning across the business school, the experiential learning partner across the business school. So without further ado, why don't I stop sharing? And David, how are you doing?
Doing fine. Thank you very much.
Good, good. Well, once again, really glad that you could join us today. And perhaps why don't we start by why don't you give us a little bit of a background into your course and what you do at Brigham Young?
Okay. Well, thank you all for having me. Thank you for joining us. It's my pleasure to be with you for a few minutes and talk a little bit about what we do here and how we use the tour operator simulation, which is the one that we've been using because until just a couple of weeks ago, I was the program director for our hospitality and tourism management program. I'm retiring in a few months, so I am handing that off to another faculty member. But our university is part of an educational system. We have 4 campuses. We are the smallest of those campuses. We have about 3,000 students, which is intentionally small. We're way out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and our geographic emphasis is Asia Pacific, the Pacific Islands in particular, And so we have a lot of students from that part of the world. And in our program, our what we call HTM, Hospitality and Tourism Management program, about 2/3 of our students are international. So things like simulations can kind of level the playing field, if you will, a little bit, because students can get into it, they can study it, they can take their time looking at the information, helping make decisions, working with a team to do those kinds of things. The course that we use this simulation in is our senior seminar. It's the final course that our majors, our hospitality and tourism majors take. And a few years ago, this is back, I guess, 2019 is when I first started working with the Edumando folks. Prior to that, we were using a hotel management simulation. And it worked fine. It was a different company that was offering it. It worked fine, but it was a little too narrow. It was too narrow because in our program, we're not a hotel management program, although we have many students who go into that field. But we also have students who go into all of the other sectors of food and beverage, tour operations, government, ministries, transportation, all these different fields. So we wanted something that was a little bit broader in scope. And as I was looking around, I came across the tour operator program, and one thing led to another, and we adopted it in 2019. So we've been using it for nearly 4 years now, quite successfully, I think. The interesting thing is that one of the foundational business courses that our students have to take, it's really their first kind of introduction to the world of business course. They use, we don't teach that in our program, it's taught by the business program, but our students use that. We use that course as one of our foundational courses. They do a simulation in that course that is focused on high-tech company management. And by the time they get to my class, then they are accustomed to the idea of a web-based simulation. But the feedback that I get on the tour operator is really positive because, first of all, they're older, they have more skills, a little more mature, they have more knowledge in the field. Plus, this program is directly related to their field of study. So it's more engaging just inherently because it focuses on the things that they've been studying for the last 3 or 4 years. And that relevance makes a big difference in the engagement and the satisfaction ratings that we get. Every semester I get quite a few students who come up to me and say, I really had a good time doing this. It was relevant. I understood the language, the jargon, and they appreciate the breadth where it's from the perspective of a tour operator, but you're also negotiating hotel contracts. You're talking about marketing activities. You're talking about other kinds of decisions that broaden the scope beyond just hotel management. So we're pleased with the program and the simulation. We've been using it. I think we plan to continue to use it. We're just tweaking maybe a little bit each year how we use the program as part of a broader experiential learning effort that we have. And I think that you mentioned that, Leon, experiential learning. That's a very important element of what we do in our program, because in our industry, it's one thing to know something. It's a completely different thing to know how to apply that knowledge. So we try to provide a lot of experiential learning opportunities for our students, everything from a practicum, a rotational practicum course, where they have hands-on experiences with local tourism and hospitality related companies early in their career. And then later toward the end, they do a management internship. And there are other things, field trips, and lecture series, and all kinds of things.
So this simulation experience complements those other experiential activities quite nicely then, it sounds like.
It does. It does. So I think it's important for context to understand that we don't use tour operator in isolation. It's part of
No.
a broader scope of trying to offer a variety of experiential learning opportunities for our students. And, you know, if you remember your university days, you can sit in a lecture hall and the teacher tells you a lot of things. You read something in a chapter, you do a quiz. It's all important learning.
Yeah.
But it's another thing to have students figure out how to apply that. For example, using the case study method, which we use, or doing simulations like this, or interacting with industry professionals, going on field trips, looking behind the house and see how things operate. And then, of course, doing an extended management internship where they can learn to apply those things. We find that those experiences are very important factors in their employability.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. I mean, so we have this vision at Edumando a little bit that every student should have an opportunity to take part in a simulated experience every year of study. And whilst that is happening in some institutions already, where we've sort of partnered to become that sort of experiential learning partner, that's not to say that we advocate for getting rid of all the other stuff that's going on. Of course, like if you've got real life case projects, for example, going on with real employers, or you've got other sort of field trips, perhaps where students can experience things, and that's the best of both worlds then, isn't it? But the simulation can do two things then. It can prepare them for those real life case projects or internships, or it can provide a way just to more generally and alongside to consolidate their learning. Did you say, David, it's a capstone course, right, where the simulation is currently used?
It is. It's typically the final course that a student will take in our program.
Okay. So it has by default then to bring all of everything they've learned and sort of consolidate that together.
Exactly. And just to illustrate that point, when they get into the simulation, and they're looking at the results of each round, there are financial data that they have to analyze. And I joke with our students sometimes and say, yeah, you thought you were going to get rid of, not have to worry about all of the accounting and finance information and techniques and concepts. Well, this is a good example of how that stuff comes back and is important in any kind of performance analysis of a company, in addition, of course, to all of the other metrics that are used. But it does bring together a lot of what they've been learning in the previous courses that they do. And I think they appreciate that. And again, that just reinforces the relevance to what they've been studying for the past several years, and it all comes together in this simulation. And of course, they enjoy the competitive nature of it as well.
Yeah. Well, absolutely. I think the competition should drive the engagement, right? That's what's really getting them excited, isn't it? And having fun, of course.
It does. And I should mention that we have a relatively small program. Because the university is small, we have nearly 350 students. It's one of the larger programs on our campus, but still that's relatively small when you look at, universities. And so they all know each other. They've been studying together for a few years and have had classes together, and many of them are friends. So there's a nice friendly competition between them. And the competition, I think, is an important part of the simulation. But I have to tell you, I'm how would I say this? I'm fairly generous in the way that I treat the scoring, the grading of the outcomes in the competition. It's not very harsh. In other words, the top team doesn't automatically get an A in the assignment, and the bottom team doesn't automatically fail. Because I don't want that to be a disincentive to stay engaged through the entire simulation, because we review each round. And so it's possible that there's a team or two that are consistently at the bottom, and I don't want them to get discouraged and to kind of become disengaged. So I reassure them that out of the 100 grading points that are possible for this assignment, nobody is going to get below, I think it's 80 or 85 points, because they're trying, they're making an effort. I want them to stay engaged.
Yeah. I think that's really important, isn't it? Because, well, for a start, you don't want to be in the position halfway through the simulation where you've got the students who are at the bottom of the ranking list that just think, well, what's the point? I'll walk away now, and I'm just not going to invest any more time. Like that would be the worst scenario, wouldn't it? So I think that's really nice that you do that. Perhaps we should talk a bit more about assessment in general, actually. But before I do, you mentioned about how there's this nice sort of friendly team spirit happening amongst the students. So do you allow students to self-select their teammates, or do you put them into groups?
Actually, I'm the one that assigns them to the groups.
You do.
My experience is if you let them self-select, the teams become imbalanced. Okay. And so what I do, and by the way, I know all the students as well by the time they get into this course. So I've typically have taught each one of them in at least one course. So what I do is toward the beginning of the semester, I assign them into groups based on several factors. I want to make sure that the kind of intellectual capabilities are fairly balanced. The demographics, male, female, these kinds of things are fairly balanced. And then, of course, for us, country of origin and English capability. I want to make sure that that's balanced across the teams as well.
So you're trying to get a good mixture of viewpoints and a good mixture of competencies, existing competencies and skills and knowledge.
Right. And I don't want to set up a particular team for failure from the beginning because they don't have some of the factors or elements in their team composition that set them up from the beginning to not do very well. Really in other words,
I'm just sorry, David, to interrupt. I was just going to say it's really interesting because obviously, as you can imagine, we deal with so many different academics and lecturers who use the simulations in different ways. And only last week we were having or possibly the week before, we had another webinar with Dr. Peter Barton from Liverpool John Moores, who was talking about a different simulation which he uses on a strategic management course. And he was saying he always allows the students to select their own teammates. And his rationale for doing so was because the students will basically enjoy it more. They'll be more like, they'll be happier. They'll get into it more from the outset. They'll put them on the sort of front foot. But what you're saying, it sounds like, is you still have your reasons for doing so, but it's the opposite, really.
It is. And as I said, the relatively small size of the program is one of the factors there because these students already know each other. Many of them are already friends and we know them. So I want to make sure that there's balance or at least close as I can get to parity on these teams in terms of their ability to compete. Because I don't want, well, we were just talking about the Premier League, right? I don't want any teams to feel like they're automatically relegated to the lower league from the outset because because they don't have the talent. They don't have some of the stars on their team like Manchester United or Chelsea, right? So that's an important factor in our program is assigning the teams to make sure that we have that kind of balance. By the way, I should also mention that these teams are assigned significantly before they actually start the simulation itself. So these teams are set up as semester teams, not just simulation teams. So at the beginning, I think it's the second week of the class, we assign them into these teams. And we encourage them, for example, to work together as teams on the various case studies and assignments that we give. The other than quizzes and tests that they have to do on their own, obviously. But when we're doing case studies or other kinds of assignments that the students would benefit from some discussion with their peers, we encourage them to use their teammates as sounding boards and discussion opportunities. So I think it's important to note that these teams are not just established for tour operator, but they run through the entire semester for a lot of other assignments as well.
Well, that's nice, isn't it? And that encourages that communication, you know, and that peer-based support as well, which is really strong, you know, because so much of the university experience, the college experience is not just the formal sort of curricula, but it's the whole experience, right? So if it's encouraging students to get talking to each other and to perhaps start to develop relationships and bonds that they wouldn't otherwise get, I think that's really strong. Which sort of leads me to another question, really, which is, I think we've spoken about this a little bit, but I can't remember exactly what happened for you and your teaching delivery over COVID and when everything went sort of online. I presume you were sort of delivering everything online in the same way as most of the world was, right? Yeah,
we in March, gosh, it seems like forever ago now, March 2020, we went remote very quickly. We went from being in class to being remote very quickly, and it was actually quite a burden for all of the instructors to convert that quickly into a remote setting. But that aside, yes, for this course, which was a challenge for this particular course, because as you might suspect, a senior seminar course depends a lot on classroom discussion about concepts and case studies and things like that. And the challenge that we had is that we could not conduct our remote courses synchronously. We had to do it asynchronously. We couldn't say, all right, meet at 10 a.m. Hawaii time on Zoom and here you go, because we had students from all over the world.
Right, so you couldn't find a time zone which matched everyone. So you couldn't, it wasn't fair to ask them all to get together at the same time.
Yeah, 3 o'clock in the morning in one place and 4 in the afternoon in another place. It wasn't really possible.
Because I often think of like, in terms of a simulation, I think of asynchronous on two levels. So one is, well, you're not asking students to work together as the whole class. But then another thing is, well, okay, they can get in their teams together whenever they like, but they still have to get together in their teams at the same time. So it's like, in that sense, there's still some synchronicity within the asynchronousness, right?
Yes, that's right. That's right. And so what we ended up doing, like I think many other universities, we ended up becoming experts in recording lectures and posting them on our learning management system. And the students would watch those, 20, 30-minute videos in addition to reading other materials that we gave them and other outsourced videos that we had them watch and do quizzes and, all the normal kinds of things that they would do. But the simulation actually was beneficial in terms of what you were talking about. It creates a little bit more of a synchronicity, if you will, to a particular element of the course, because even today, when we're back in the classroom, the students typically have to meet together as a team outside of the classroom in order to make decisions and to, discuss cases or whatever that they're doing. And we encourage that. We encourage that. So that was happening even during remote times, where the students would just, among the team, find a way that they could meet together on Zoom or FaceTime or whatever it was. However, I will say that one of the things we tried to pay attention to during that is assigning students to teams with a little bit more geographic proximity, so that they weren't spanning the entire range of time zones across the world. But of course, when we're back in the classroom, that's not relevant.
No. But I often feel that over COVID and when everything was online, it was even more important to have those opportunities for students to get together in their teams, because they weren't getting all of those moments in the corridors, you know, and bumping into each other in the food halls and these sorts of things. So actually, when everyone was isolated on their own in their four walls of their room, the simulation time in their groups was a really nice break from all of that, and a chance to get together and talk, because it was a structured chance, for them to do so.
Yeah, it was, and also even still, we encourage the students to set up some sort of online collaborative space like Google Docs or something like that, where they're communicating with each other, they're giving input to decisions that have to be made, they're recording various kinds of data from their decision making so that they can go back and refer to that. So that worked well, of course, during remote COVID times as well as now.
Yeah, no, that's nice. Well, look, just to say, for all the participants who perhaps have joined late, thanks for coming in. We're talking to David Preece at Brigham Young in Hawaii, and well, we're talking all things simulations and developing real-world competencies. So it's been great talking so far, David. I was keen to go actually back a little bit more to the assessment, because we started to talk about that, and I think you were saying that, so like part of the overall credit for the course as a whole is the simulation. But for the simulation piece specifically, you use the ranking list, but you're quite generous there. But perhaps you could tell us a little bit more about that. But maybe just before you do, I suppose I was keen to put a caveat in there to say that from my experience with dealing with many of the academics we work with all over the world, I would say that's not typically like the usual way of doing it. So, but then usually I find that the simulations are embedded more within a specific unit or course rather than a capstone course necessarily. So in those instances, usually the assessment is some combination of perhaps group presentation and individual reflective piece, but of course, based on the outputs of the simulation of the experience the students have taken. But please tell us a bit more about how you do it.
Well, I think it would help if I talked a little bit about the course overall and how the simulation fits into the course. As I mentioned, this is a senior level capstone course. They tend to be hopefully more mature and better skilled, more knowledge when they come into the class. And it's an important course. They recognize that this is their final launching pad, if you will, into their career. And we try to bring together most of the major key concepts that they've been learning for the past several years into the course. There, just in terms of the pedagogy itself, there are 1,000 grading points for the course. The team simulation is about 10% of the course grade. This semester, for the first time, actually, we're starting this next week. For the first time, we're doing an individual competition. So after they've done the team rounds and the team competition finishes, then they go into an individual competition, if you will, hopefully applying what they've learned through the team competition for another 10% of the grade. And then they have to do a reflective assignment at the end of the semester that says, you know, what they liked about the simulation, what they didn't like about it, what they learned from it, some of the key concepts that they might be able to apply in the future, and so on. And that's another, you know, kind of nominal grading point. So there are several ways that we can grade this as we go through. The bulk of the grade for the course are the case studies that they do. And I think they do four major case studies. And then there are reading quizzes and those kinds of things that happen through. And then the final exam for the course is actually an oral exam that they do. That actually we started during COVID times. We had to record those, where they would record their oral exam based on a random question that they were presented. And they had a few minutes to think about it and then speak for up to 5 minutes on this particular management subject. We've kept that remote. We may go back to a live faculty panel, but it's remote now. So that's the way the course is structured. So it is part of a lot of other assessment elements throughout the course. And I think it works well that way for us. I'll give you an example.
Sure.
One of the major concepts that we study for a particular week is Michael Porter's generic strategies. And so they have reading materials and videos that they watch and assignments related to that and so on. And then we also do another week on the SWOT analysis and other kinds of strategic planning management concepts, including Michael Porter's competitive model, competitive forces, the 5 forces model. Well, when they get into the simulation, some of the strategy choices that they have to make in the simulation are tied back to Porter's models. So by the time they get there, they're familiar with these concepts because they've already studied these in the previous weeks. So that's just one example of how we try to integrate some of the other learning content in the course with what they're learning in and applying in the simulation itself.
No, that makes sense. And David, well, there's a question actually in the chat from Dr. Jolly Sani. Is it mostly the strategic management course? So I think is it because it's a capstone course, right? So it's not just strategic management that you're trying
That's
to consolidate.
Correct. Yeah, I mean, keep in mind, of course, we're talking about hospitality and tourism management. So there's that narrow focus in the course of naturally. But I would label it more as a leadership development course. We do talk about strategic management concepts and models and analytical tools and the kinds of things that I've mentioned, among others. But one of the things that I try to help the students understand is that you manage things, but you lead people. And that's why I call this more of a leadership course, because in our industry, hospitality and tourism is a people business, as I think most businesses are. Even if you're in manufacturing of widgets or something like that, people are still probably your most important asset in your organization. And of course, you have customers you have to relate to. But in our business, the people that work for you are your brand. And the interactions that your customers have with your employees is the company. That is the company. So we try to help students understand that as a manager or leader, your primary responsibility is to find, hire, train, and keep really great people. So that is actually a very important underlying concept in our course, as is, by the way, the principles of sustainability as they relate to tourism. Those are two very prominent conceptual frameworks that run through the entire course. So is it a strategic management course? Yes, in many ways it is, because they're being taught how to use these various analytical tools and other kinds of models to make strategic decisions. But I think it is more fair to label it as a leadership development course, because that's what we want our students to become, is leaders.
Yeah, no, really, really nice points, David, actually. And I think, like, from my perspective, I think even when we consider strategic management frameworks, and if that's what we want to, so even if this were not a capstone course, right? Even if it was specifically a strategic management course that you are asking students to compete in this simulation, I still often sort of feel like, well, yes, we want you to consider these strategic management frameworks, which you've probably hopefully covered from a theoretical standpoint already. And so now you're going to apply them. But then you've got to apply them in relation to something. They can't just be standalone strategic frameworks, because they're not going to make any sense unless it's in correlation with some other part of the business, right? So strategic, so like strategic, for doing a SWOT analysis, well, it's got to be a SWOT analysis on the business, hasn't it? And so that's thinking about the implications in relation to your people, in relation to the external environment, whatever it might be. Same with everything. You know, the generic strategy linked to Porter's. Well, we've got to have products and customers in mind when we're thinking about that. So
yeah, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And if there's one thing that I've learned over the years that's really important in our program, and that is creating the proper context, learning context. I'll give you another example that doesn't have anything to do with the simulation, but I suppose it does in terms of pointing out how we use it. Years ago, our students were required to take microeconomics from the economics department, Economics 200, that every business-related program has to take. But our students weren't doing very well in the course. And when we looked into it, the reason that we figured this, that we found out, was because they weren't learning it in context. Particularly for the students who were majoring in hospitality and tourism, it was too abstract. It was too theoretical. And so we created our own course called The Economics of Global Tourism, which for the first 6 or 8 weeks, they go through the basic ideas and principles that they would learn in any economics course. But then they go through the subsequent weeks. They're taught how to apply those concepts in each of the sectors: transportation, accommodations, food and beverage, and so on. And all of a sudden, the light bulb turns on because they can see the context. And that's one of the reasons that the tour operator program works well in our class, is because it's not abstract like what they did in the foundational business course where they were doing high-tech management. It was interesting. It's not irrelevant, but there's not enough context for our students who are in our program. And that's why I think they're more engaged and they actually enjoy it more, because it feels familiar to them.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think I often talk about this context and the relevance piece, because it's so important, and it doesn't matter if it's HR, or if it's marketing, or if it's strategy, or if it's operations, any of these pieces. If students can't relate that theory to something tangible, then we've really missed something. We've missed an opportunity, I think, for the students. And I think case studies go some way towards achieving that, but the simulations go a step further, because it places the students sort of in the center of the case study and gives them the opportunity to shape the outcome of the case study as well.
Right. Yeah, it's in fact,
exciting.
one of the increasingly applied concepts in education is gamification. And I think that these students in particular have grown up playing computer games of various types. Yeah. And it feels very natural to them. It feels like they're playing a game. I try to avoid using the word game, but that's kind of the way it comes across to them. And they're all very comfortable in that kind of an environment that is cloud-based, that is graphic in nature, where they're making decisions and they are actually kind of determining the outcome, like you can in certain games where, you choose to go down this hallway instead of that hallway, and it presents a different scenario to you. I think they like that. And I think they enjoy it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and where they can have an opportunity to see how they're doing as they go, like to see their score as well. Of course, that's a big part of gamification too. Please, everyone who's here, all the attendees, it's great to have you here. Please put some questions into the chat, because let's make this interactive and let's have a bit of a conversation. So David's here to answer any questions you've got as well. Dr. Jolly Sani, thank you again for your comment. Experiential learning is the key now, absolutely. Well, we're firm believers in that. Yeah, absolutely. So we think that every student should have the opportunity to be able to apply their learning, their theory in a safe environment and in a fun way. So yeah, if anyone has any more questions, please feel free to put those in the chat now.
By the way, Callum or Leon, let me just mention, when you think about the course that this simulation is a part of, it's filled with all kinds of simulations. A case study is a different kind of simulation, isn't it? A field trip is another kind of a simulation, and an internship is a different kind of simulation. They're all designed to simulate a real world work experience or decision-making experience or whatever it is that you're trying to teach, applying strategic concepts or ideas or skills or knowledge that they have. So as we've been talking, I've realized that really our program, not just in this course, but our whole program is filled with various kinds of simulations. And this happens to be one type.
Sure. No, absolutely. I'm not sure if you can see the chat as well, but I can read these out. So all this is using technology. Are there any ways for non-technology based games? So that's from Dr. Jolly Sani. So you're already using many business games in your management classes. Well, yeah, I mean, there are, of course, there's other things. In fact, I'm aware of a couple of existing, I wouldn't necessarily say simulations, but sort of games that are used in a more sort of traditional board game sort of scenario in class. Of course, our focus as a company, as Edumando, is around digital technologies. And we're firm believers that that also provides an additional benefit in promoting the digital literacy skills of students as well. So giving students exposure to technological applications, digital applications, and help sort of close that digital skills gap too. But yeah, not sure if you have any thoughts on that, David?
Well, yes, absolutely. I think the more digital skills that can be enhanced are only going to help them in their career, because everything is now based on some sort of technology or another. And the more adept, the more comfortable that they are with various kinds of technologies, the better qualified they are to do what they're going to do, because certainly they're going to be using them throughout their career even more. I do see one comment here about resources. I'm glad that came up, because when we were looking at different simulations to use in this program a few years ago, one of the things that impressed me was the support services that Edumando provides. And we use them in basically two ways. One of them, of course, is there's an actively managed help desk for tour operator, where somebody on your team gets an email message within the system, and they can respond and help students with some technical issue or a question about decision making or whatever it is. And I think that's very helpful, because the simulation that they do early in their career, the one that I mentioned about technology, there is no really actively managed help desk. And so I think they get frustrated sometimes, because I'm the instructor and I've been using it for several years now. And I think I know the simulation pretty well, but I'm not an expert in the algorithm. And so it's good for me to be able to tell the students, use the help desk and they can answer some of these more technical questions. It makes it easier for me, and I think it makes it comfortable for the students. The second thing that we do is the representative that's assigned to our account is generally available for doing things like a Zoom session. So in fact, we have one tomorrow morning. Tonight is last night was the deadline for the final round in the team competition. So in a few minutes here, we're going to be in class reviewing the final round, final results of the simulation. And one of your representatives will be on Zoom with us doing that together. So what we do typically is we have a kickoff session, a kickoff Zoom session with your representative to kind of give some instructions about what the simulation is and how it works. And these are the different resources that you have, and they can walk through a demonstration and things like that. And then the students do 2 practice rounds as a team that are not graded. They're just simply to help the students become familiar with the system. And then they do 7 competitive rounds as teams, which is, as I mentioned, wrapping up today. And then during I think it's after it's after the practice rounds, and before we start the competitive rounds, we do another Zoom session so that the students can ask questions coming out of the practice rounds as they prepare to go into the team competition better prepared. And then we're doing another video session this morning after the competitive round is done, before they start the individual rounds. And I think that's meaningful because it helps the students better connect with and understand the simulation so that they're not just on their own. They can ask a real person who knows the algorithm questions about the system and how it works.
No, absolutely. Well, no, thanks for saying that, David. That's really nice, I think, for the attendees to get a sense of what the support structure looks like, because I think there is sometimes this perception that learning a new system and starting to implement that with the students is going to be quite a bit of an undertaking that maybe isn't too welcome. But the fact that we'll do all the setup for you, we'll be there on the first day to support your students, to present to the students, it just takes the pressure off you as the academic, doesn't it? And well, the fact that you can say any questions, ask the help desk as well, that's quite nice too.
Yeah, it does. I admit that was an important element in starting this up. I didn't necessarily from day one have to be the expert in the simulation. I obviously know it a lot better now than I did before, but
Sure.
Still I have the resources to depend on so that I don't have to be the technical expert.
No, absolutely. Okay. Well, I'll tell you what, as we've got about 5 minutes left, and there doesn't seem to be too many more questions, what I'll do is I'll share my screen now, and perhaps I will, just give us a very, very brief demonstration of what the simulation that you're using, David, looks like. So if I do so, perhaps you can just feel free to chime in as well as I'm talking, if you've got anything to add. So maybe the first thing to say is, well, this is called the tour operator, the online tour operator. And it's a management simulation, which is played in teams, of course, as we've been discussing. So in the teams, the students will take over an existing sort of Expedia-like online tour operator. And they'll start off by coming to the profile section. They'll give their company a new name. They'll come up with a nice slogan which summarizes what their company is all about. And they'll even upload a logo for their company, which is a nice way for them to start, a nice fun way, gets them thinking about this. And well, they can do this first, but of course this should reflect their strategic direction of the company too. So perhaps they can also think about their strategy first and then do this part. That's a little bit flexible. We'll also ask each player, so each team member, to upload their name here and even take a little role here. So if you want, you can ask the student teams to perhaps for one team member to be the CEO and one to be the marketing director and one to be the financial director. It's a little bit up to you, or you can ask them to leave it blank. Actually, do you have a view on that, David? How you do it?
Well, I leave that part up to them. They can choose to divide responsibilities up, and they usually do, because there may be a student who tends to be more of a leader type that wants to make sure that things are moving along, kind of a project management. There may be some who are more comfortable with financial decisions, financial reporting, and are more comfortable in that area.
Sure.
So, in one in marketing and so on. So yeah, I think they do kind of naturally fall into that.
Okay, fine, all right. Well, once they've done that part, the next bit we ask them to do is to start to undertake some external analysis and also the internal analysis of their company too. So if we come to messages here, well, every round, the student teams will be getting these news items. So it's important to say that this simulation is an entire fictitious world, right? So all the news items here are also fictitious, but it's really nice because it's a simulated environment. So every round they'll click on something and they'll read a little bit of information about what the news item is. Now, it's important that the teams are reading these carefully each round because that will reflect what's going on in the world, perhaps something linked to a dip in demand for a certain segment, or it could be some sort of issue with a certain country. Maybe there's not possible to fly people over to a certain country or something like that. So it's really important that the student teams are reading those. We then ask them to come to the results section. And this is where they can, of course, start to look at the financials of their company. So they need to have an idea of how much cash, of course, they've got to invest in their company. And well, they can get all the financial documents here, as well as information on how they're performing. So like which hotels they currently have and the occupancy details. So it's important to say that within this simulation, the teams can choose to make these allotment agreements with these hotels in various parts of the world. So they can choose which countries to do business in, so which countries to offer their holidays for. But within each country, they'll also have to decide on a hotel level. So they can view all the information here about hotel results, about market share in relation to their competitors. And in this simulation, they're actually measured on the balanced scorecard. So it's not just the financials, but it's a mixture of those and the longer term goals as well. So things like market share, customer satisfaction. And here you can see how they're performing in relation to all of these traffic light systems in relation to each of these points. Just to pick up a couple of...
If I could just,
go
I'm sorry, if I could just make a comment here. We spend a lot of time focused on the balanced scorecard for some of the reasons that you just mentioned, and also as a tool to help students understand that striking that balance across all these measures is really, really difficult. So for example, you can see this team, their personnel satisfaction is not very high and that they feel overworked. Well, that typically means you have to add some more staff to spread the workload around or increase their compensation a little bit, except that costs money. So they have to recognize that that's going to have an impact on their profitability. And that kind of interaction between these different metrics is an important lesson for them to learn. The other thing that I wanted to mention is the strategy. Maybe you could go to the strategy tab up there. Something that I mentioned before, these different strategy models, for example, the value model here or something, so these are some things that we talk about in class. And the other really important thing that I try to pound into the head of our students as they're doing this is that the algorithm either rewards or punishes you for decisions and their level of alignment or misalignment with your strategic decisions. So if you position your company as being focused on operational excellence and strong value and competing on lower price and those kinds of things, you then have to pick hotels and set up contracts and pricing with those hotels in a way that matches that strategic decision. You're focused on maybe budget-oriented hotels, value-oriented hotels, rather than really high-end, fancy, expensive hotels, because that doesn't fit your target audience. So that's one of the things that I really like about the simulation is the strategic decisions that they're making are not just done in isolation. The strategic decisions that they make, or the position that they establish themselves in strategically, should have a direct impact on the tactical decisions that they make. And then the algorithm recognizes if those things are in alignment, and if they're not, your balanced scorecard goes down. If they are in alignment, you receive more points. And I think that's an important lesson for the students to learn, is to get that strategic to tactical alignment in place, because of course in business you have to do that.
Really good points, David, because I think absolutely. I mean, I think it's not the case that there's one right strategy, isn't it? Like, it's not to say this strategy is the right way to do it and this is the wrong way to do it. But what's important is that whatever strategy you've chosen, you're then taking decisions that reflect that strategy in reality and put it into fruition, hopefully, and help propel your business forward. Of course, it's also dependent on what your competitors are doing as well. And it may be,
of course,
it may be bad luck in that all your competitors have also chosen exactly the same strategy as you, in which case, well, that's going to mean you're all struggling because you're all going after the same customers. But that's again, part of the beauty of it. It's sort of very close to real life in that sense. So yeah, well, I think that's perhaps given people who are attending a little bit of a view on it. So they work through the external and internal analysis. They then go to, once they're armed with the information, they'll work through these strategy parts. And these are very flexible. So we can actually add different strategic frameworks, or we can remove some of these if these aren't taught in your course.
By the way,
flexible.
Leon, if I could mention that this is also at the discretion of the instructor. So the instructor can go in and decide which strategy elements are going to be applied in the simulation, and they can customize that based a little bit on what they're teaching in class. So I don't use all of these. The ones that I use typically are related to strategy concepts and tools and things like that we discuss in class.
Absolutely, yeah. But then they'll work through a range of decisions where they're making these great agreements with the hotel chains and thinking about the distribution of their staff, of course, to marketing decisions as well. And then at the end of each round, when the the calculation happens for all the teams at the same time, it produces the new set of results for the next financial year. And so a new set of news items, new financial documents, but also importantly, a new ranking list. So this is where teams will come, of course, straight away to see whether they've gone up or down in the ranking list, which we position as a stock exchange just to make it a bit more exciting for the students, of course. So that's it in very very quick overview. So perhaps, well, we're already at 4 minutes over time. I'll stop sharing. Well, I think that we'll probably close now. Perhaps we can just take 1 more minute if anyone else has got any more questions. Otherwise, if you do have any more questions, then feel free to get in touch. We'll be happy to take your questions, of course. Other than that, David, it's been really, really good talking to you again. And well, thanks so much for putting aside some time. I know it's quite early in the morning for you there, isn't it?
Well, it's coming up on 9:30, so not too early.
Okay, not too bad.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, yeah, I don't think we have any more questions. So, David, you're free to go. But thank you so much again for being part of this. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you all. And by the way, if anybody has a direct question for me, I suppose you can contact our friends at Edumando, and they can forward that message to me.
Perfect. Okay. And can people connect with you, for example, on LinkedIn or anything like that?
Yes. Yeah. You can find me there. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Okay. Perfect. Okay. Well, I've put up a slide here as well where you can find my email address as well if you want to get in touch. But I'm sure you've all got our marketing colleague, Callum, his email address. He would have sent you the joining details for this. So feel free to get in touch with either of us. Otherwise, well, thanks again, David, and webinar is over.
Thank you. Aloha, everybody.